Margaret Thompson stands outside her childhood home in Burlington, Vermont, keys trembling in her hand. She hasn't been back in 15 years, not since her mother's funeral. The house looks the same from the outside. White clapboard siding, black shutters, the maple tree her father planted when she was born now towering over the roof. But something feels wrong. The air smells different. The light seems harsher. Even the sounds are alien to her. She walks down the street where she once knew every family, every dog, every crack in the sidewalk. Mrs. Patterson's house still has the same yellow shutters, but Mrs. Patterson died 8 years ago, and now it's owned by someone who works remotely for a tech company in San Francisco. The Kowalski's place has been torn down and replaced with something the real estate listing called a contemporary executive home. The corner store where she bought penny candy is now a boutique selling artisanal soaps for $40 a bar. Margaret sits on the bench at Riverside Park, the same bench where she had her first kiss, where she told her best friend about her college acceptance, where she decided to leave this place behind. The bench is still here, but everything else has been renovated into something that looks like a stock photo of small-town America. It's prettier than she remembers, more polished, more perfect, and completely foreign to her. "This isn't my hometown anymore," she whispers to herself. "This is just a place that happens to be where I grew up." Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden forces that reshaped our world. If you're watching this from anywhere around the globe, drop a comment below telling us what time it is where you are and which city you're viewing from, and hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to discover explains one of the most unsettling experiences of modern life. Returning to the place that made you, only to find that it no longer knows who you are. This feeling of hometown alienation isn't just nostalgia for a simpler past or the natural result of personal growth. It's the consequence of powerful economic, social, and cultural forces that have transformed American communities in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Your hometown didn't just change while you were gone. It was systematically replaced by something designed to serve entirely different purposes for entirely different people. The story of why you don't feel at home in your hometown anymore is really the story of how America became a country where place has no memory, where community is a commodity, and where home itself has become just another consumer product to be optimized, marketed, and sold to the highest bidder. Let me take you back to understand what home used to mean and how we lost it without even realizing it was disappearing. In 1955, if you traveled across America, you could tell where you were just by looking around you. Boston looked different from New Orleans, which looked different from Denver, which looked different from Portland. Not just the architecture, though, that was part of it. The entire texture of daily life was shaped by local geography, local history, local culture, and local economy. Cities and towns developed organically over decades or centuries, shaped by the rivers they sat beside, the industries that employed their residents, the immigrant groups that settled there, the natural resources available locally, and the transportation networks that connected them to other places. Every community had what urban planners call local character, a unique combination of physical features, social customs, and economic activities that made it unlike anywhere else. This local character wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional. Communities developed in ways that made sense for their specific location and circumstances. Coastal towns built their economies around fishing and shipping. Mountain towns developed around mining or timber. Prairie towns served agricultural regions. River cities became manufacturing centers. The physical layout of these communities reflected their economic purposes and social values. Downtowns concentrated civic, commercial, and cultural activities within walking distance of residential neighborhoods. Different income levels lived in the same areas, though often in different types of housing. Children could walk to school, adults could walk to work, and families could walk to shops, churches, and entertainment. Most importantly, these communities were controlled by people who lived in them. Local business owners made decisions about what stores to open and where. Local bankers made decisions about what development projects to finance. Local politicians made decisions about zoning and infrastructure. Local newspapers covered local issues for local audiences. Local schools taught local children who would likely remain in the community as adults. This created what sociologists call place attachment, deep emotional and psychological connections between people in specific locations. Your hometown wasn't just where you happened to live. It was a unique environment that had shaped your identity and reflected your values. You belonged to it, and it belonged to you. But starting in the 1960s, a series of changes began to undermine the economic and social foundations that had created distinctive local communities. The first change was the rise of what economist Bennett Harrison called the Great U-turn, the shift from locally owned businesses to nationally owned corporations. Between 1958 and 1977, the number of independent retailers in the United States declined by over 40%, while the number of chain stores increased by over 300%. This wasn't just about shopping options, it was about economic control. When local businesses dominated local economies, money spent in a community tended to circulate within that community. Local business owners hired local workers, bought from local suppliers, banked with local banks, and invested their profits in local real estate or local business expansion. Corporate chains operated differently. They extracted money from local communities and transferred it to distant corporate headquarters. They made purchasing decisions based on national contracts rather than local preferences. They hired managers rather than developing local entrepreneurs. They standardized operations rather than adapting to local conditions. The economic impact was profound. Studies showed that every dollar spent at a local business generated about $2.90 in local economic activity, while every dollar spent at a corporate chain generated only about $1.40 in local economic activity. Communities with more local businesses had more entrepreneurs, more civic leaders, and more locally controlled wealth. But the cultural impact was even more significant. Corporate chains began to homogenize the American landscape in ways that erased local differences and local character. Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, was explicit about this goal. "We have found out that we cannot trust some people who are nonconformists," he wrote in his autobiography. "We will make conformists out of them in a hurry. The organization cannot trust the individual. The individual must trust the organization." McDonald's didn't just serve standardized food, it created standardized places. Every McDonald's restaurant looked the same, felt the same, and operated the same, regardless of whether it was in Manhattan or Montana. The company's operations manual specified everything from the exact temperature of the French fry oil to the precise wording of employee greetings. This standardization was supposed to ensure quality and efficiency, but it also eliminated the local variation that gave communities their distinctive character. As corporate chains displaced local businesses, downtowns began to look increasingly similar across the country. Meanwhile, changes in federal policy were reshaping the physical structure of American communities in equally dramatic ways. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways, the largest public works project in American history. These highways were ostensibly built for national defense, but their real impact was to enable what urban planners call suburban sprawl, low-density development that spread communities across much larger geographical areas. The highways made it possible to live in one place and work in another, to shop in a third place and recreate in a fourth. This spatial separation of life activities undermined the cohesion that had characterized traditional communities where home, work, shopping, and social life were geographically integrated. Sprawl was further encouraged by federal policies that subsidized suburban development while discriminating against urban investment. The Federal Housing Administration provided government-backed mortgages for suburban homes but not urban apartments. The tax code allowed homeowners to deduct mortgage interest but didn't provide comparable benefits for renters. Federal transportation spending favored highways over public transit. These policies weren't neutral. They were designed to promote a specific vision of American life based on suburban homeownership, automobile dependence, and spatial separation of different activities. But they had unintended consequences that fundamentally altered the relationship between people and places. As jobs, shops, and services spread across larger geographical areas, communities became less walkable and more automobile dependent. Children could no longer walk to school, so they rode buses or were driven by parents. Adults could no longer walk to work, so they commuted longer distances. Families could no longer walk to shops, so they drove to shopping centers. This automobile dependence changed the texture of daily life in subtle but profound ways. Instead of encountering neighbors during walks to work or shops, people spent more time isolated in cars. Instead of frequenting local businesses where they knew the owners and employees, people drove to suburban shopping centers where they were anonymous consumers. The rise of shopping malls epitomized these changes. Victor Gruen, the architect who designed the first enclosed shopping mall, originally envisioned malls as town centers that would recreate the civic and commercial life of traditional downtowns. But malls were privately owned and centrally managed in ways that traditional downtowns were not. Mall management controlled which businesses could operate, what activities were allowed, and who was welcome in the space. They could exclude businesses that didn't meet their financial criteria, restrict political activities that might offend shoppers, and remove people whose presence was deemed undesirable. This privatization of public space meant that commercial considerations took priority over civic values. As malls attracted businesses and customers away from traditional downtowns, many city centers entered a cycle of decline that lasted for decades. Empty storefronts led to reduced foot traffic, which led to more business closures, which led to further deterioration of the urban environment. But the forces reshaping American communities were just getting started. The next wave of change would be driven by technological innovations that made location itself increasingly irrelevant to economic life. The development of computer networks in the 1990s enabled what economists call the Great Decoupling, the separation of economic activity from specific geographical locations. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people could work from anywhere, shop from anywhere, and maintain social relationships with people anywhere. This geographical liberation was initially celebrated as an opportunity to revitalize small towns and rural areas that had been bypassed by industrial development. Telecommuting would allow knowledge workers to live wherever they chose while earning big city wages. Small towns could attract residents and businesses based on quality of life rather than proximity to employment centers. But the reality was more complicated. While some people did use technology to escape expensive cities, many more used it to access economic opportunities without committing to any particular place. The result was the rise of what sociologist Richard Florida called the creative class. Highly educated, highly mobile professionals who treated geography as a consumer choice rather than a lifetime commitment. Members of the creative class moved frequently in search of better job opportunities, more interesting cultural amenities, or more attractive lifestyle options. They might live in Portland for a few years, then move to Austin, then relocate to Brooklyn, then take a job in San Francisco. Each move was rational from an individual perspective, but collectively these mobility patterns undermine the stability that communities needed to develop strong local institutions and distinctive local character. Even more destabilizing was the rise of what economists call the attention economy. Business models based on capturing and monetizing human attention rather than producing physical goods or local services. Companies like Google, Facebook, Netflix, and Amazon could serve customers anywhere in the world from centralized locations that employed relatively few people. A software engineer in Mountain View could create products used by billions of people, but the economic benefits of that productivity were concentrated in a handful of superstar cities, rather than distributed across many communities. This geographical concentration of high-value economic activity created unprecedented inequality between places. Cities like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, and Boston attracted enormous amounts of investment and talent, while smaller cities and rural areas were left behind by an economy that no longer needed their particular geographical advantages. But the most dramatic changes were still ahead, driven by the financialization of real estate that would transform homes from places to live into assets to be optimized for maximum return. In the 1970s, most Americans bought homes primarily as places to live and raise families. Real estate was considered a relatively stable investment that appreciated modestly over time, but few people expected to get rich by buying and selling houses. That changed dramatically after the inflation crises of the 1970s, when real estate emerged as a hedge against currency devaluation. Financial innovations like real estate investment trusts mortgage-backed securities, and eventually algorithmic trading platforms made it possible to treat real estate like any other financial asset that could be bought, sold, and traded for maximum profit. The financialization of housing attracted enormous amounts of global capital into local real estate markets. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, and individual investors began competing with local residents for housing in communities where they might never live or even visit. This financialization was particularly pronounced in communities that offered what real estate investors call lifestyle amenities, natural beauty, cultural attractions, recreational opportunities, or simply the charm of authentic small-town character. Places like Burlington, Vermont, Asheville, North Carolina, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and hundreds of similar communities became investment destinations, where housing prices were driven by speculation rather than local wages and local needs. Young adults who had grown up in these communities often found themselves priced out of the housing markets they had expected to inherit. The irony was profound. Communities that had maintained their distinctive character and charm, precisely because they had been relatively isolated from global economic forces, became attractive to global capital exactly because of that distinctive character and charm. But the same capital that was attracted by authentic local character also had the power to destroy that character by displacing the local people who had created it. This process accelerated dramatically with the rise of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb, which enabled property investors to extract more revenue from real estate by converting long-term housing into temporary tourist accommodation. In tourist-friendly communities, property owners discovered they could make more money renting to visitors for a few days at a time than renting to local families for a full year. This was economically rational for individual property owners, but collectively it reduced the housing stock available to local residents while increasing the housing stock available to tourists. The results were predictable and devastating for community stability. Long-term residents were displaced by rising housing costs. Local businesses struggled to find employees who could afford to live nearby. Essential workers like teachers, nurses, and police officers were forced to commute longer distances because they couldn't afford to live in the communities they served. But housing financialization was just one aspect of a broader transformation. The rise of what urban planner Teresa Caldera calls fortified enclaves, residential developments designed to provide security and exclusivity for affluent residents while minimizing interaction with surrounding communities. Gated communities, exclusive subdivisions, and luxury condominiums created what sociologist Evan McKenzie calls privatopia. Private governments that provided services and amenities for residents while avoiding the compromises and obligations of broader civic participation. These privatized communities offered undeniable advantages: better security, higher property values, more control over the immediate environment, and freedom from the problems that afflicted less affluent areas. But they also created what political scientist Robert Reich calls the secession of the successful, the withdrawal of affluent residents from shared civic institutions and collective problem-solving. When wealthy residents could provide their own security through gated communities, their own recreation through private clubs, their own education through private schools, and their own infrastructure through homeowner associations, they had less investment in the quality of public institutions that served the broader community. This secession of the successful undermined the cross-class coalitions that had historically supported public investment in schools, parks, libraries, and other shared amenities. It also reduced the tax base available to support public services, while increasing the burden on remaining residents to maintain civic institutions. Meanwhile, another force was quietly reshaping the cultural landscape of American communities, what anthropologist Marc Auger calls non-places. Standardized environments designed for efficient transit and consumption rather than human habitation and community life. Airports, shopping malls, chain restaurants, and suburban office parks exemplified non-places. Functional, clean, safe, and utterly forgettable. They could be anywhere and therefore belonged nowhere. They served their immediate purposes efficiently, but they created no sense of place attachment or community identity. The proliferation of non-places meant that increasing amounts of daily life happened in environments that were designed to be temporary, transitional, and anonymous. People worked in office parks that could have been anywhere, shopped in malls that looked identical across the country, and ate in restaurants that served the same food with the same decor regardless of location. This wasn't just an aesthetic problem, it was a psychological problem. Human beings have deep needs for spatial orientation, cultural identity, and social belonging that non-places cannot satisfy. When more of life happens in non-places, people lose what environmental psychologist Roger Barker calls behavior settings, specific locations that support particular types of social interaction and cultural meaning. Traditional places like town squares, neighborhood bars, local diners, and main street shops had served as third places, social environments that were neither home nor work, but something in between. These third places provided opportunities for casual social interaction, community networking, and civic engagement that were essential for maintaining social cohesion. Non-places eliminated these opportunities for unplanned social interaction. You might spend hours in a shopping mall without having a single meaningful conversation with another person. You might eat regularly at chain restaurants without ever getting to know the staff or other customers. You might work in an office park without ever meeting people from other businesses in the same complex. But the final blow to traditional community life came from an unexpected source. The digital technologies that promise to enhance human connection while actually undermining the geographical basis of community life. Social media platforms like Facebook were originally designed to help people maintain connections with friends and neighbors in their local communities. Mark Zuckerberg's original vision was to digitize the social networks that already existed in specific places rather than replace geographical communities with virtual ones. But the business model of social media required constant growth in user engagement, which was better served by connecting people based on shared interests rather than shared location. The algorithms that determined what content people saw prioritized posts that generated strong emotional reactions over posts that fostered local community building. The result was the rise of what sociologist Barry Wellman calls networked individualism, social relationships based on personal choice rather than geographical proximity or family connections. People could maintain hundreds of online relationships with people they had never met while losing touch with neighbors who lived 20 feet away. This shift from place-based to choice-based relationships had profound implications for community life. Traditional communities had been composed of people who might not have chosen to associate with each other, but were thrown together by geographical proximity and had to figure out how to get along despite their differences. Digital communities were composed of people who shared specific interests, values, or identities, but had no obligation to work together on the practical challenges of shared physical space. You could belong to online communities focused on your professional interests, political beliefs, cultural preferences, and hobby activities without ever engaging with the people who shared your actual neighborhood. This voluntary segregation into affinity-based networks reduced the cross-cutting social ties that had historically moderated political conflict and encouraged civic cooperation. When people's primary social relationships were with others who shared their beliefs and lifestyle preferences, they had fewer opportunities to practice the skills of democratic citizenship that require working with people who think differently. Even more fundamentally, digital technologies change the relationship between memory and place in ways that undermine the psychological foundations of community attachment. For most of human history, memories had been embedded in specific locations. The corner where you met your future spouse, the building where you got your first job, the park where you played as a child. These places served as repositories for personal and collective memory that connected individual biography to community history. Digital technologies externalized memory in ways that made physical places less psychologically significant. Photos were stored in clouds rather than physical albums displayed in specific homes. Messages were preserved on servers rather than letters kept in particular drawers. Social relationships were maintained through screens rather than through repeated encounters in specific locations. This externalization of memory meant that places became less emotionally significant over time. When your important memories were stored digitally rather than geographically, physical locations had less power to evoke the sense of belonging and continuity that created place attachment. The cumulative effect of all these changes was the emergence of what anthropologist James Holston calls insurgent citizenship. The feeling that traditional forms of political and social belonging no longer provide adequate identity or security. People who felt disconnected from their geographical communities began to seek identity and belonging through consumption choices, lifestyle brands, political movements, and online communities that promised more authentic forms of connection than what was available in their actual neighborhoods. This wasn't necessarily a conscious choice. It was often an adaptation to circumstances beyond individual control. When your hometown had been transformed by forces you didn't understand and couldn't influence, when your neighbors were strangers who might move away next year, when your local institutions were controlled by distant corporations or absent investors, it made sense to seek community elsewhere. But this adaptation to placelessness created new problems that most people didn't anticipate. Human beings appear to have deep psychological needs for geographical rootedness that cannot be fully satisfied by virtual communities or consumer identities. Environmental psychologist Roger Ulrich's research shows that people who live in environments with strong place identity have lower levels of stress, better mental health, and greater life satisfaction than people who live in generic environments. Other studies show that children who grow up with strong place attachment develop higher levels of environmental stewardship, civic engagement, and social responsibility as adults. When these psychological needs for place attachment are not met, people often experience what environmental psychologist Susan Clayton calls environmental identity dysfunction. Chronic feelings of rootlessness, meaninglessness, and social disconnection that manifest as anxiety, depression, and various forms of addictive behavior. This may explain why rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide have increased dramatically in communities that have experienced the most rapid transformation from traditional place-based communities to modern placeless environments. The opioid epidemic, for example, has been concentrated in communities that lost their economic foundations due to factory closures, mining industry decline, or agricultural consolidation. But it has also been severe in communities that maintained economic prosperity, but lost their social cohesion due to rapid population turnover, housing speculation, or cultural homogenization. The common factor appears to be the loss of what sociologists call collective efficacy, the shared belief that community members can work together to solve common problems and create better outcomes for everyone. When people don't feel connected to their neighbors, when they don't trust local institutions, and when they don't believe their individual actions can influence community outcomes, they become vulnerable to various forms of escapism and nihilism that provide temporary relief from feelings of powerlessness and meaninglessness. But the story doesn't end with the destruction of place-based community. Across America and around the world, people are experimenting with new ways to create authentic community life in the context of modern economic and technological realities. Some of these experiments focus on placemaking, the intentional creation of physical environments that foster social interaction and community identity. Cities like Portland, Oregon have created pocket neighborhoods that combine the privacy of single-family homes with shared common spaces that encourage neighbor interaction. Towns like Seaside, Florida have used new urbanist design principles to create walkable communities that integrate residential, commercial, and civic activities. Other experiments focus on community land trusts and cooperative ownership models that give local residents more control over their housing and commercial development. Cities like Burlington, Vermont, have created municipal broadband networks that serve community needs rather than corporate profits. Rural areas like the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia have developed community-supported agriculture programs that connect local farmers directly with local consumers. Still, other experiments focus on using digital technologies to enhance rather than replace geographical community. Apps like Nextdoor help neighbors communicate with each other about local issues and opportunities. Platforms like Meetup enable people to organize face-to-face activities based on shared interests within specific geographical areas. Cities like Madrid, Spain, have created digital democracy platforms that give residents direct input into municipal decision-making. These experiments suggest that place-based community can be rebuilt, but only through intentional effort that addresses both the economic forces that undermine community stability and the cultural forces that erode community attachment. Rebuilding authentic communities requires economic policies that prioritize local ownership, affordable housing, and sustainable development over maximum short-term profits for distant investors. It requires transportation and land use policies that create walkable, mixed-use environments where people can meet each other through daily activities. It requires digital policies that enhance face-to-face interaction rather than replacing it. But most importantly, rebuilding authentic communities requires individuals who choose to invest in places rather than just passing through them. This means shopping at locally owned businesses even when chain stores are more convenient. It means participating in local civic organizations even when online communities are more entertaining. It means staying in places long enough to develop relationships with neighbors and investment in community outcomes. The choice between placeless mobility and place-based commitment isn't just a personal lifestyle preference. It's a choice about what kind of society we want to live in. Do we want communities where people know each other, care about each other, and work together to solve common problems? Or do we want a society of mobile individuals who optimize their own opportunities while remaining strangers to the people who happen to live near them? Margaret Thompson's experience of returning to her childhood home represents a choice that millions of Americans face every day. She can remain a stranger in the place that formed her, accepting that home is just a memory that has been overwritten by forces beyond her control. Or she can decide to participate in creating new forms of community life that honor both individual freedom and collective belonging. The feeling that you don't belong in your hometown anymore isn't just personal nostalgia. It's a symptom of larger social changes that have affected everyone. But it's also an invitation to participate in rebuilding the kinds of communities where people can feel genuinely at home. That rebuilding starts with understanding how we got here, continues with imagining where we want to go, and requires the daily work of treating our neighbors as neighbors rather than strangers, our communities as homes rather than pit stops, and our shared places as sacred rather than disposable. Professor Archive will continue exploring the hidden forces that shape our world, but this particular story is still being written. Each of us, through our choices about where to live, how to consume, and how to relate to our neighbors, becomes an author of whether future generations will feel at home in their communities or remain forever strangers in the places that shaped them. Before you go, remember to subscribe to Professor Archive if this journey through the forces that transformed American communities resonated with your own experience. Drop a comment below, letting us know what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and share your thoughts. Do you feel at home in your hometown? What changes have you witnessed in your community? What would it take to rebuild the kinds of places where people can truly belong? The story of why you don't feel at home in your hometown anymore explains much about modern life, but it doesn't determine our future. That future depends on choices we make starting today about whether to accept placelessness as inevitable or to begin the patient work of creating communities where people can genuinely belong.